Outside In?
Sure. Hi, good morning, everyone. And thanks so much for taking time out on a Sunday morning to spend with us on science. We hope to make this worth your while. You know, right now there's a solar eclipse going on, and a lot of people are very interested in that. And I'm really glad that all of you have taken the time out to attend this instead. And I promise you that your takeaway from this session is going to be something that is probably a little rarer than a solar eclipse, if I dare say so. It's putting a lot of pressure on Sanjay, but I'm sure he'll forgive me. I just want to say thank you so much to Saudamani, whose fantastic idea this was to have a session on ecology on Sunday mornings. For a lot of us who are stuck at home, this is a great way to experience the outside world while staying inside. So I'm really, really happy to be part of this entire venture. The comms office of the Bangalore Life Science Cluster are really happy to support you, Sodamani. And with that, I will give it over to you so you can introduce the speaker, and then we'll be underway.
Thank you, Mahin. Thanks, Chandrakant, Mahin, and Pavitra. You're all doing an excellent job bringing in so many students over for the webinar. And I'm so overwhelmed. Hello, all. Welcome to the second webinar in the series of Outside In. And yeah, so in traditional teaching, especially in schools, people are used to teaching science, which is heavily compartmentalized, say physics, chemistry, and biology. But then actually biology is very integrative. And for instance, you know, the laws of the physics and chemistry are followed in biology. So are the rules of mathematics and engineering also maintained. And today, Sanjay is going to talk about how mechanics and engineering feeds into biology, say the architecture of anthills and so on. Sanjay's lab has been interested in how vision and mechanosensory actions of antennae enable the flights of insects. And for Sanjay, interacting with the school children is a natural thing, and he has been doing this, I must say, since 2013. And some of you may be already aware that he conducts what is called as a Moths Day, where more than thousands people, mostly students, and when I say people, people of all age, are drawn into NCBS, and he interacts with them about the science, the beautiful science of moths. And therefore, I think Sanjay is more than happy to interact with you today. And with this, Sanjay, please.
Thank you, Sadamini. Thank you, Mahin. Thank you, Chandrakant. I'm just going to quickly share my screen. Okay, can everyone see this? Okay, so I thought what I'll do is talk today about how study of animals has inspired engineering. This is a topic that I got interested in partly out of just taking long walks and interacting with people who were just as excited about animals as I was. And I find that over the years, this has been an extraordinary venture for me, for my lab, and something that we have now slowly started to take from just kind of gossiping about it to actually working in this area. So what I'm going to do is give you a brief sense of some examples of animal engineering that have inspired human structures. Some of these are things that have to do with the actual structures that are built, and some of these have to do with the processes, and these really span across all aspects of engineering, but my main focus is going to be on architecture in this talk. After that, I'm going to talk about a short history of the new field of what is called bioinspiration and biomimicry. I'm going to argue that this is not a new field, that this is actually as old as science itself. And then finally, I will take you through some of the ongoing research in this area, including in my lab. So let's start with something exciting. And what you're going to see shortly is a clip on beavers. Okay, so for those of you who may not be aware, there are about two species of beavers. There's one in North Americas and there's another in Eurasia. And these are extraordinarily busy animals. You know, there's a term in English for busy as beavers, and that is inspired by beavers. And you'll see in this clip why that is the case. Okay, so
Beavers are vegetarians. They gnaw through bark to eat the sugary layer underneath. They've been gnawing through forests for 20 million years. Felling trees with your teeth takes great strength, skill, and patience. One technique is to slice halfway through and let the wind do the rest. The beaver's incisors are strengthened with iron, which makes them orange. They grow continuously and even self-sharpen. The pond makes it easier to move around the heavy logs they need to build their dams. Out of the water, it's a struggle. Stones help weigh down the base. The whole family works together, carefully interlocking the timber. They dredge mud from the pond bottom to seal the dam. Each pond traps several inches of sediment every year, so there's plenty of it. The young act as apprentice builders, learning the tricks of the trade. The final results are impressive. In the Rocky Mountains, beaver dams slowly filter billions of tons of water. The ponds build up soil and nutrients and help prevent floods and droughts.
this is impressive by any standards. These beavers have evolved over several million years to be able to uh, build dams. If you may not be aware, they have lodges that are sort of submerged by these dams. That's really why they do it, so that they can submerge these lodges, and that makes them inaccessible to predators. But it also allows beavers to kind of swim through the water and be able to catch fish and stuff like that. In the process, beavers have been able to create extraordinary changes in the landscape, which is one of the reasons why they are often referred to as keystone species, because these dams will often cause uh, pools of water that are rich in nutrients and that support a large number of fish, bird, and amphibian populations. And it, to, to people who are interested in sustainability and sustainable living, this is something of a fabulous example. You can look at many news articles about beaver dams that are being built, inspired by, dams that are that are inspired by beavers. And these are just naturally fish friendly. I mean, beavers, if they weren't fish friendly, beavers would not be able to eat fish. And they are generally sustainable. And I think this is one of the key lessons that I want to push on uh, in this lecture about why it is important to learn from animals. Let's take another example. These are another movie, and this time the commentator is somebody who many of you might know. the extraordinary David Attenborough, and some of these BBC films that inspired many of us to become biologists. Now, the impressive thing about this structures, and we find these on our campus, and I'm sure it's across India, you can see these termite mounds. And the one on the left here is one in South Africa. And as indeed, Africa is full of a large number of termite mounds, which have inspired much research. What is not as well known is the fact that there were people who were interested in trying to understand how these termite mounds are kept infection-free. After all, they house the entire colony, so it should be free of germs. We acutely understand this today because of the virus epidemic. It should be well ventilated so that there's all constantly fresh air. Otherwise, a colony can build up carbon dioxide, and that is toxic to the colony itself. And remember, there's also brood in these colonies. And they should be kept at a constant temperature. Otherwise, they will heat up or operate at temperatures that are not suitable for their growth. And this incredible structure is able to do all of that, and we don't fully understand how. The little research that was done in this area in the early part of the last century, early to middle part of the last century, inspired the construction of a mall in Zimbabwe, which was based entirely on principles learned from termite mounds. And it uses much less energy than most malls and is able to do remarkably well in terms of creating a sustainable model for how these kind of structures should be constructed. In case you thought that engineering required a large number of insects or rodents with fairly sophisticated brains, let me show you the next video, which is a single wasp at work. Okay, and this wasp, I'm going to explain what it's trying to do. So this wasp takes a ball of clay from its vicinity and brings it to the site where it's building. And watch it carefully. It's moving its antennae constantly to assess the texture of the inside. At least that's what we think it's trying to do. And it is constantly smoothing and building these kinds of pots. Again, extraordinary rate. They've already built one pot that's right there, and there's another one. And we slowly come to my favorite part of this video, which is when the wasp now goes, gets another ball of clay, and this time uses this ball of clay to form the mouth of this pot. You might ask, why is the wasp constructing this really interesting structure that looks very much like the early pottery. And what it does actually is eventually it will lay eggs inside this pot and then go out, sting the larva of some insect, and put the larva in. It literally physically carries this larva in flight, and then drops the larva inside, and then the insects, its own progeny, when the eggs hatch, will start eating this larva. There it lays the egg. It will eat this larva, and that's what it uses to grow. And this extraordinary structure has evolved over hundreds of millions of years. We have many examples of this, and one has to really ask if the early kind of prehistoric pots, which bear great resemblance to the pots of a humble wasp, were actually inspired by this. And if they were, then one can hardly overstate the influence that this humble creature has had on our civilization. There are many questions that come out of simple observations like this. Water wasp is something we see in our backyard all the time. Um, but if one is to stop and think about all the processes that go in a brain that is, carrying out all these amazing functions, uh, one one is tempted to question what you often read in the newspapers and things, that these have simple brains, that insects have simple brains. I beg to differ, especially when I see these videos. So these three examples point to a growing number of examples of what is really exciting to science, and a large number of people who were traditionally biomechanists are now sort of collectively starting a field called biomimicry and bioinspiration. That's the sort of name that's been given to this field. There's also a journal by that name now. So let's go through what biomimicry and bioinspiration really is. Biomimicry is the design and production of materials and structures and systems modeled on biological entities and processes, things that you observe in nature that you want to then recreate um, in the lab, or in a factory or something like that. And bioinspiration is the development of novel materials, devices, structures, etc., that are inspired by biological evolution and refinement over several million years. The aim here, I should emphasize, is not to copy the design principles, but just to be inspired by them, and not sort of append uh, the um, ingenuity of an engineer, because engineers will often come up with solutions that you don't find in nature. The wheel is a very prominent example of this. So both of these terms, if you notice, are directed at engineers and inventors because they involve development and design of new solutions. But the idea is that you take engineers and inventors or curricula that will produce such people, and you put them or interface them with biology and evolution, which allows you to then make better engineering products. The big question is this idea really new? And over the next several slides, I'm going to take you through the history of the field of bioinspiration, biomimicry. I'm going to argue that it's not new, that it is, it finds its antecedents in deep history of science. So when did it all begin? On your right here is a picture of Hippocrates. Hippocrates was among the earliest physiologists who aimed at trying to understand the relationship between what we call structure, how it looks or how it is built, and function, which is how it operates or how it carries out some function using empirical methods. If you can imagine, this was a radical idea at the time. You didn't just take something and kind of infer what it might do. You actually needed to do experiments to understand them. He also argued that diseases were due to natural and not supernatural causes. And you can imagine that in the times that he lived, much of what happened was sort of fatalistically attributed to supernatural causes. But he argued that that is not the case, that they belong to the realm of science and testability and not supernatural and occurred. And this meant that we really needed to study nature as a discipline and not just sort of be the end consumers of whatever happens around us without having any understanding or sort of observations into these processes. Aristotle, who's widely regarded as the father of science, so I don't like terms like that, but I'm just sort of repeating what one finds in the literature, wrote the first major treatise to relate structure and function in biology. It was an early attempt, but he also wrote among the first laws of physics. But what's really impressive was that he very closely observed animals in nature and compiled all these observations in a book, which was very, very influential. It was called De Motu Animalum. And these principles and these ideas that Aristotle prescribed all the way back in the late 300 BC or so, held sway over much of the scientific community all the way through Renaissance, which is almost 2000 years later. So did nothing happen between Aristotle and Renaissance? Well, not the case. Actually, in a sense, the world was preparing for many of the kind of great discoveries to come. A lot of that happened in the East. We invented the decimal system, the concept of zero. Galen took the approach of Hippocrates, further formulated the theory of blood circulation by closely observing what happened in monkeys and pigs. So he dissected these animals and looked at blood circulation, and then we came up with some idea of how this might work. Another very important personality in history is Ibn Sina, who's in the Greek literature called Avicenna, whose book of healing and the canon of medicine were, and in many ways are still sort of the founding texts of medicine in the Middle East. And they, in parallel with the Indian Ayurvedic tradition and the Chinese medicine in China, have been very influential in our medical practices. And this includes things like surgical practices, plastic surgery, acupuncture, which are all kind of mechanistic and empirical in nature. They involved experiments, they involved trials, and sort of looking at how well the trial succeeded, etc. We then come to what may be one of the most important figure in the history of bio-inspired engineering, and that would be none other than Leonardo da Vinci, who systematically studied anatomy, so form, physiology, so function, how it worked, and also physics in terms of his observations about fluids and solids and the principles of mechanics. And he actually used these observations, which he very carefully documented, and we have many of these documents down to this day. He used them to construct inventions of extraordinary complexity. For the longest time, he was hired by the Sforzas to be their sort of key engineer, military money essentially. So he was busy inventing things that would be useful to not just the conduct of war, but conduct of society itself. And many of these inventions were actually so far ahead of their time that they couldn't be constructed in his time, and they had to wait for some time before people could actually design them. And these inventions involve not just end products of things, but also processes, things like better ways of operating levers and things like that. Just little parts of machines, which are also very, very important. Is particularly impressive is how he observed. This video tells you just how closely he observed nature.
Leonardo's last and in many ways his finest campaign of anatomical investigation was into the structure of the heart. Working mainly with an ox's heart, he dissected it to an extraordinarily fine level of detail, and the sheet of studies you see here is an investigation of the functioning of the aortic valve. Now, Leonardo realized that at the root of the aorta was a slight swelling, a chamber which we now call the sinus of Valsalva, and he wanted to investigate the function of this. So he injected molten wax into the aorta, and it set, and he could see this bulb shape when he dissected it away. And then he made a glass model around that wax cast, and he shows it in cross-section here. And then he could pump water with a suspension of grass seeds through his glass model and observe these vortices in the sinus immediately above the aortic valve. And he deduced that these vortices played a crucial role in the opening out of the cusps of the valve after each pump of the heart. And it's absolutely right. It's only in the 20th century that cardiologists basically agreed with Leonardo that the vortices in the sinus of Valsalva are crucial for the function of the aorta. It's the most incredibly sophisticated piece of investigation and shows Leonardo as an experimental scientist at his absolute best.
So around the time, the reason that this period is called Renaissance is because around this time there were many people who suddenly caught on to the idea that mechanics was there was something universal about mechanics. And among the great figures of this time is, of course, Galileo Galilei, who who was among the earliest people to appreciate how universal the laws of mechanics were. And this was a great step from the Aristotelian view, where I think the advances made in this time were just sort of hugely over and above what was being taught in the textbooks of the time, which was much more of an Aristotelian view. Galileo published a book called, I don't know how to pronounce it, but the Mechanics, where he introduced this as a field, and he said that this is the way to look at things, sort of establishing the underlying physics of it. Interestingly, this book contains a lot of material on the mechanical properties of bone and the scaling. And this is important to understand. This is a physics book, by modern standards, but it contained a lot of material on the biological world. At the same time as Galileo, William Harvey discovered that the heart was, in fact, the mechanical pump. It was not the seat of the soul, as most people thought it was, and much of this enters the English language. It was, in fact, a mechanical pump, and this pump, pumped blood into various parts of our body, and that's how it kept us going. The realization that simple laws of mechanics are universal, that they apply to everything that we see, was extremely profound. The other thing that was really profound was the fact that around the same time, people realized the importance of using mathematics to encode language, to encode logic. I mean, if you were to, think of all the logical steps that you have to go through to make simple detections, I'm sure predictions, for instance, I'm sure you've all looked at puzzles where they say, oh, A is the sister of B, B is the father of D, D is the, son of so-and-so. So what is the relationship of between A and X? If one were to just string out this logic in statements, it becomes very difficult to keep track. And so it really limits how much you can think. The genius of bringing mathematics into this was the fact that you could encode logic in very simple ways and just go through the mechanics of mathematics, just the steps. And that allowed you to take great strides and think of things that were of incredibly complex nature. And this accelerated the progress of physics in a very short time span. I must add, I would reckon within 100 years, the entire course of science changed. One of the key figures in terms of conceptualization of this was René Descartes. Descartes is a giant. This is, he's very much part of modern textbooks, for instance. And, he observed very early that animals follow laws of physics. He was breathing the same air as Galileo and William Harvey and Newton, who I'll talk about later. But he observed that animals follow laws of physics, and that he then argued that, this means that animals also follow laws of animals which follow laws of physics must also be, very machine-like. And so he said maybe, that there are stimuli in the world and animals react to them in very specific ways and very deterministic ways. And thus all actions should be reflexive and encoded within the animal. And thus animals are essentially very sophisticated automatons, was his main argument. I should let you know as a sideline that he did not include humans in animals because he, as most people thought at the time, that humans had souls. We know now that is not the case. But it's something that Descartes made an exception for. What are the corollaries of the Cartesian idea, the ideas coming from Descartes? Well, first is, of course, as I mentioned, that animals are biological robots or automatons, that if you give them the same stimulus, we should get the same response. Robot does exactly the same thing in every single trial, depending on what stimulus you give it. If there are variations in response, then that is a symptom not of something inherently different about the robot from one trial to another, but it's a symptom of the imperfection of the experimenter. So in other words, it's a bug rather than a feature. As you can see, this is one that simply doesn't fit animals. Now, to understand animals, we must therefore tightly control their environment and expect the same outcome with minimal variation. I should mention that this is exactly the approach we follow to this day, and that is how important Descartes' contribution is to science, is that he laid down a certain process, the method by which one must think about things. So any variation that still exists is then due to an internal state of animals attributed to motivation, free will, etc. And this is where ideas that of a philosophical nature and remain to this day to be mostly of a philosophical nature. Shortly around that time was also this extraordinary figure called Giovanni Borelli, who studied animal motion, and what he titled his books after Aristotle's, he De Motu Animalium 1, 2, and he was somebody who closely observed how animals moved and then designed machines that were inspired by these observations. And again, he's widely regarded as the father of the field of biomechanics. And there's an award named after him in the Society of Biomechanics and so on. He was somebody who really closely thought about how these kind of phenomena observed in nature could be analyzed and converted to technology. All of you know about Newton, of course. Newton took mechanics to greater heights by integrating Galilean concepts and also combining them with the astronomical observations of Kepler. So it was Newton who realized that the reason the apple falls to Earth is the same reason as why the moon goes around the Earth. And this is just remarkable that you could take some small observation like that, or some immediate observation like that, and connect it to the universe itself. What Newton also did, which was extremely important, was develop methods, mathematical methods to do these calculations. He is widely regarded with Leibniz as the inventor of differential and integral calculus. And calculus was used to test the validity of the laws of mechanics to a very, very fine degree, which remains a landmark in science. Unfortunately, Newton did not seem to have given much thought to biology. It's somewhere around this time, it appeared that physics and biology kind of split. Not entirely, of course. There were always people who continued to dabble in different areas, but it became a time when people sort of went from being natural philosophers who thought about everything to specialists who were mostly kind of physicists or mathematicians or biologists or doctors or things like that. On the biology side, one of the great realizations came from Carl Linnaeus, who figured out a way to classify all animals and created a revolution in biology of being able to then, systematically name things. And once you can name and discriminate between things, then you are sort of able to describe them better and understand them better. And he also, had remarkable findings through his studies. But it was really revolutionary how Linnaeus kind of gave structure to what must until then have been just a kind of amorphous observations. The next 2 centuries was mostly about consolidations. Within biology, there was lots of taxonomy and description and so on. And physics and astronomy, in mechanics, there was mostly applications to physics and astronomy. And 2 fields kind of diverged. On the one hand, physiology was making great progress, but purely as a medical discipline. Physics was making huge progress, but mostly as a scientific discipline, and with of course, applications into mechanics. And all of this kind of came together with the Industrial Revolution when large-scale machines led to the birth of assembly line and automation. The next step in biology came from Darwin and Wallace, who proposed the theory of evolution by descent and natural selection. And they, were able to then make sense of all these different species that were there and sort of unify concepts under one umbrella of evolution. They also put forth the idea of evolutionary adaptation being important. This is really an important concept when one thinks about bioinspiration, bioengineering, because a lot of what you see are adaptations. So every structure is an evolutionary product of natural forces and serves specific functions. So studying structure in its natural context was important. And this is the key insight that came from a lot of what happened up until Darwin. And this also meant that we could understand fossil data better and infer function, ask questions like what is this for? And that led to the field of functional morphology, which is the precursor of modern biomechanics. And that was the first major step towards sort of the reintroduction of bioinspiration and biomimicry. So getting everything to come back together. So what have we learned so far? Well, first thing is that the traditions of observing nature and making inventions date back to the dawn of science and human industry. This is not a new concept. It has been around forever. The most major contributors of science were multidisciplinary. They thought about many things. In many ways, Newton too was multidisciplinary, except they didn't think much about biology. And even there, I may be wrong. Newton continues to surprise. Importantly, the boundaries of disciplines are not natural. They're human constructs, and we should never forget that. We should take ourselves wherever the problem takes us. And because human needs are similar to animals, we are animals too, it is essential to observe nature very closely. It is not possible without a strong component of field studies in our curricula. So that was about the short history. It's not, it's much longer than I've made it out to be, but I'm sort of talking about the salient features. And let's look now at what sort of things are happening in this area. One of the most influential books, at least influential for me, is this one that I've put up on the screen. It's Vehicles by Valentino Breitenberg. It's a really fascinating book in which he shows or describes many simple instruments or robots that can do very complex things. And the argument is that a lot of what you see in animals is still the Cartesian idea. A lot of the complex behaviors that you see in animals are essentially products of very simple algorithms that underlie these various behaviors. Some extraordinary new developments have occurred. One of the more prominent ones is the Gecko adhesive mechanism. Just briefly talk about it. So for those of you who haven't seen geckos, they are a kind of lizard that is able to walk on surfaces. And one of the great sort of insights was that their ability to walk on vertical walls or even upside down was because they were able to grip very nicely to the walls or substrate. And the reason they could grip nicely was that their feet were highly lamellated. The area is the surface area that contacts the wall is very high, and what they then do is form connections due to van der Waals forces that allow the gecko to get an extraordinary grip on vertical surfaces as well as upside down. So scientists studied this. This is not that long ago, just a few decades ago, and they realized that this is extraordinary. One could actually make adhesive tapes, and you could then use these principles to develop interesting robots. And I'm just going to show you a film.
In the quest to build a better climbing robot, mechanical engineers at Stanford chose an unusual muse, the gecko.
We talked to biologists and we said, well, okay, well, what animals are out there that are that have really excellent wall climbing abilities, and they're fast, they're agile, and so on. Gecko stands out. They can run at 1 meter per second, up, down, in any direction. They can work on both smooth and rough surfaces.
Grad student Elliot Hawks, along with other researchers, developed a substance that, like gecko feet, can easily attach and detach to surfaces repeatedly. And it works without magnets or electricity.
The adhesive is made out of silicon rubber, so it's not actually sticky. It has a cool property that when you just touch it to the glass, it doesn't feel tacky or sticky at all. But when you put your weight on it, it then engages.
The invention led to a superhero moment for Hawks. These pads, equipped with the adhesive and supports for his feet, turned Hawks' hands into gecko toes, letting him scale this 12-foot wall, albeit slowly.
That had been a goal for a couple of years, and it was very exciting to get up there and look down and be like, all right, we did it. If we lift it off with a rubber band doesn't really even stretch. But now we come down here, wrap the rubber band around the loading point and pull.
The key to the adhesive is a sea of tiny wedges invisible to the human eye. This silicone model shows what a single wedge looks like enlarged 100 times.
When you bring it into a surface, initially they're like so, and because it's just the sharp tip of the wedge, the contact area is very small. So there's no adhesion, they're not sticky. But now if I apply a shear force, they all bend over like this. And suddenly the contact area is much larger.
This microscopic feature gives the adhesive its unique properties, but makes it challenging to produce in larger quantities.
We make this adhesive, we make the mold by hand, we do micromachining, and then we cast the polymer into the mold, and we make little patches, 4 by 4 inches or 10 by 10 centimeters at a time. It's sort of a handcraft.
NASA is exploring using the adhesive to grab space junk. And the CEO of a car company sees the potential to streamline windshield installations.
They use suction, which leaves a big circular suction mark at the end, which he then has to do a whole other step to clean afterwards. And since ours doesn't leave any residue, he was very interested in that.
But don't cling on to hopes for tapping your inner Spider-Man. Stanford isn't looking to license the technology for any climbing devices. In Stanford, California, I'm Sumi Das, CNET.com for CBS News.
I was very lucky to see some of this work from the sidelines. I was a graduate student in Berkeley, just down the hall from Bob Full's lab, where much of the early insights into these devices were where they came out of. Another very interesting use of biology, if you will, is to look at processes. How can you build better processes rather than inventions or products? And this film tells you a little bit about that. So,
ants are great tunnelers. That's how they make their nests underground. But even they run into traffic jams like this one here. That's not surprising, but the solution is. Experiments with fire ants showed that the key to avoiding jams and solving ones that do occur is idleness. 30% of the ants do 70% of the work, and that turns out to be ideal. Add more ants to the working pool, and productivity suffers. It's not that any particular ants are lazy or that they know how to avoid jams completely. Ants do pile up, but they're easily discouraged by a jam and good at backing up and turning around, allowing the remaining workers to continue digging. Some of the ants don't even go near the tunnel. The researchers tested their ideas about optimal ant behavior using robots and magnetized spheres. With simple instructions to gather the spheres, the robots all rushed to work at the same time. The result, gridlock. But with some idleness programmed in, the robots were more productive. Here you can see the original group versus ones programmed to think more like ants. In the real world, this kind of programming could make robot swarms more effective at searching disaster sites or delivering drugs inside the body. So why don't ants just make wider tunnels with more room for digging? Well, here's what happens in a wider tunnel. Sometimes it's hard to hang on to the sides, and sometimes they completely lose their grip. How embarrassing.
So yeah, I showed this last one because I want to emphasize that it's not just products like a pot or a mall or a mount that can be that one can take inspiration from, but also the processes, how animals do things that allow them to conduct themselves efficiently in nature. And I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned from this that you know we could do well as a society to look at other societies that have co-evolved with us. Let me now, in the last 5 minutes or so, maybe a little more, take you through some of the work that's going on in my lab. And we are really inspired by the idea of insect architecture, which is all around us. You know, and just a few examples of this: the rock bees, so-called Apis dorsata, generate these large hives where they live and they store honey and brood, and they are extraordinarily resilient, as are weaver ants, which we find in our backyard again. These are ants that build these extraordinary nests from using their larvae, and they generate a film by pressing on the larvae, and that they use that as a thread to stitch these leaves together. There are many other examples. I'm not going to go over all of these, but there's paper wasps, which make these paper nests, very light, very resilient. Carpenter bees that make nice round holes in dead wood and make these little chambers where they can store their brood. And harvester ants, about which we know very little. These are extraordinary structures. We don't fully understand them. In fact, insect architecture is everywhere. We recently did a survey of how many different kinds of insects build things. And here's a list of them. I'm sure this is not an exhaustive list, but you have earwigs, dung beetles, crickets, caddisflies, insects of all kinds are building structures. And you can see from these very nice sketches by my student, Shubha Ramaswamy, that these structures are really diverse in nature. There's as diverse as the insects themselves, and all of them, I can safely tell you, are by and large understudied. That there needs to be much more work done on this, and also I can assure you that they're all in your backyard for the most part. You will find some representative in your backyard that is able to construct these extraordinary structures. Well, what we are really interested in is what are the algorithms that lead to these structures. And we've outlined 5 of these. I won't go through all of them, but each one of them tells you something about how a starting stimulus leads to a reaction. We are interested in how the brains of these animals function and how behavior is developed. And so these algorithms are really geared towards that. how they lead to a certain outcome, and how that outcome then, is eventually slowly molded into the final outcome. In some cases, there is just feed forward kind of one-way actions. There is no feedback. Animals just continue to build in a very robotic fashion, to use that term. In other cases, they actually care about the structure, so they're constantly keeping track, such as the potter wasp that you saw. If you were to cut the pot midway through, the wasp would make adjustments, and so that's more like sort of some of the things that we see here. And then there are cases where, in this case, there are these ants that build these nests. They essentially dig holes, bring soil out, and they deposit it. And what you see are these very nice mounds of granular soil around the nests. And they are quite amazing in their own way. And these are the results of many different ants working together to build these structures. But these ants are working sort of like this. Every individual is doing what they're doing without really interacting much. Once you start putting in those interactions, it's begin to get really interesting. So for instance, in this case, what you see is those interactions, they're shown by arrows here, between individuals. Those interactions lead to some structure, and then that structure is fed back into these reactions, and you get this really interesting nests of the beaver ants. And then finally, the termite mounds, which is really what we are studying. And these are, again, extraordinary structures where the animals interact with the structure, and then the structure informs the next set of steps. So it is something the field is calling stigmergy principle, the idea that coordination between animals is happening through, it's mediated by the structure. And just to give you a sense of what our work involves, this is a typical termite mound in our backyard. My student Amrita Anshwats is standing. He's about 6 foot tall, so you can imagine how amazing these structures are. These are in our backyard. We are on CBS campus in this film, and as you can see, this, if you go down into the and peek into the nest, you can see that there's tremendous activity going on, and you can see that it may look amorphous, but if you notice closely here, there's a lot of traffic going on that is, unhindered, and everyone is able to do their work. Termites are interesting because these mounds create these alates, certain, if I use the term casts for insects, that have wings, and they have eyes, and they can fly around and mate. And then after mating, they begin to grow. This thing is about as large as the thumb of an adult human. And all it is full of eggs and ovaries, and it just generates eggs, and those eggs lead to soldiers and workers, different termite castes, which then go on to build the mounds. That's sort of the cycle. Soldiers and workers are blind, so only the termites that can fly have eyes, and yet they're able to do all of this without any discernible blueprint. And so termites work incessantly. What they do is they take little pellets of mud, and then they roll it around, they coat it with some fluid, maybe just water, and then they push it against the surface. And this is how they build these structures. And the work of a large number of termites leads to these extraordinary structures. So one of the experiments we do is we create a little hole in the mound, and we ask, will the termites repair it? And as this video will show, they not just detect the hole in the mound, they very quickly repair it. And if you watch carefully what's happening here in this time-lapse image, then you can see that they are quickly covering up this hole, and we can plot how fast they're doing this. And this all happens in a matter of just a few 20 minutes or so. and then the hole is closed. This is very much like wound healing. They initially just put a scab on the hole, and then later on they sort of bolster it with more building. And we can infer from this a lot of things about how termites work. For instance, we know that the rate at which they work, etc. I'm not going into details here. Suggests that they are recruiting their nest mates, and that must mean that they're communicating with each other. And also, once the job is close to being done, there is a de-recruitment, and we don't know how exactly that works. Another problem that we're studying is that of milling. So if you drop a whole bunch of termites, it's something anybody can do. Then in due course, it's just a little circular chamber. In due course, they will all organize, self-organize, and they start to go around the chamber. And this is called milling, and this is something that we are using in an assay to understand how traffic in termites works. We can quantify it, we can take films, anybody can do this, you can do it with your cell phone camera. It's really, really simple. And it's very exciting to be able to do this. And we can show many things. For instance, that this is a density dependent. This is density dependent. So there's nothing happening in this particular video, for instance. But the moment you add more termites and it becomes denser, then everything begins to self-organize. This is now an assay that you can work on in the laboratory to be able to study traffic in termites. We know that they use mechanosensory cues. So, for instance, here the termites haven't got an established. So, if you remove the sleeve, then they just disperse. But once the traffic is established, it doesn't require mechanosensory cues. What it does is it just sustains itself. So now, if you remove the sleeve, as you'll see, the termites continue to mill around without any mechanical restraint. And this is something that led us to realizing that there must be chemical trails that they lay down, and we can use these kinds of principles now to understand what chemicals are involved, from where they come from, and etc. And these chemicals work across species. So you can have one set of across different populations. You can have one set that lays the trail. Here we had this established traffic, and now we clean the structure and now drop a whole new bunch of termites in there. And as you'll see, they very quickly find these trails and then they organize along these trails. So these are the sorts of observations. I'm just giving you just a flavor of the kinds of things we're doing. And there's a fair number of experiments that went into this. But this allows us to understand a lot about the processes that are going on in the termites. And just to sort of end with a final film on how research like this feeds into engineering, I'll just give you a very quick video. This is from Justin Werfel.
Termites are what motivated this whole project. We learned about these termites, these centimeter-long insects that together build mounds that can be 40 feet or more tall. And we said, that's amazing. That shows that these large numbers of independent agents, all with limited sensing and no central control, that they can together build very large-scale, complicated structures. That's fantastic. Now, how would we do that? How would we build and program robots so that they build according to these same kinds of decentralized principles, but together produce particular things that we ask them for? This video is sped up 5 times because the robots actually move very slowly. They're capable of moving faster, but we have them moving very deliberately. They're being very careful to get everything right. Sort of measure twice, cut once. So here we've sped up 15 times. The robots are actually moving at about 2.5 feet a minute. So the main window is showing sort of a 3/4 view of the 3 robots building the structure. In the lower left is an inset showing a top view of the same thing. So if you're a human asking these robots to build you something, you start by giving them something like a picture of what you want. You give them basically a blueprint. And a computer takes that and annotates that with the equivalent of traffic rules. That gives the robots guidelines on how they're allowed to move through the workspace. Each one has its own brain, doesn't know what the other ones are doing. They're not getting directions from any central command. And they also each have all their own sensing. They can only tell what's going on right around themselves. They're working together in the sense that they're all working to build the same structure, but they're working independently. Each one is acting on its own. If you got rid of one of these robots, it wouldn't affect what the other two were doing. If you got rid of two of the robots, the third one would be able to keep going and finish the job by itself. The long-term vision of a system like this is to do automated construction in settings where humans can't easily do it. So for instance, if we want to send astronauts to Mars, it's very hard, very dangerous and expensive to send astronauts to build there. It would be ideal if we could send a team of robots on ahead to build them a habitat, so that would be waiting for them when they show up. Of course, that's, again, a very long-term vision. Something that might be shorter term, still on the order of years, but maybe not decades, is to have a system like this build levees out of sandbags to protect against flooding. Classically, the times when you want to use robots instead of people are situations described by the 3 Ds, dirty, dangerous, and dull. And something like building with sandbags in a flood zone is all of those things. Right now we send in the National Guard. So if we could have robots do that for us, that could help us keep people out of harm's way. Again, not these specific robots, not these exact algorithms, but you can imagine how systems like these could be adapted to build walls out of sandbags to protect against flooding.
Okay, so let me just conclude the talk by saying that, well, over billions of years evolution, plants, animals have resorted to multitudes of different strategies to survive in the natural environments. We need to and carefully document these. So field studies are essential. Biologists are needed to describe these problems. They understand these better than engineers do from the framework of the animals and why the animals are doing this. But engineers can actually take a large number of lessons from this and improvise, leading to novel inventions. And I emphasize the improvise part. We don't want to just copy. We want to actually fuse human ingenuity with lessons that are learned from nature. And these are both part of the same program. So what you need is engineers to work together with biologists, and each one to understand a little bit of what the other does. And this is not possible unless our curricula become more liberal. We have to stop thinking of ourselves as biologists or engineers, but rather have the questions guide what all we need to learn. Again, biology is constrained in form. There's new designs don't happen in biology. They're built on past designs. I hate to use the word design here. I'm just talking about the animal structure. But engineers have no such constraints. And as I mentioned earlier, one major example of this is the wheel, which did not arise in biology. We still use legged locomotion or something like that, or crawling or stuff like that, but there are no wheels. Yet wheels are remarkable in their ability to take us around. And also, it's also important to know that biology isn't necessarily optimized. It's often multifunctional. A robot is typically a device that does one thing, but we are yet to sort of explore the multifunctionality of robots that are doing many different things. And then when we start to get into that area of robotics, which is again inspired by biology, then we will have a different set of challenges in terms of optimization of their function. For all of you there's a simple take-home message, which is that animal engineering is all around us. It is in our backyard. All you have to do is go out, look at insects, look at birds as they build their nests, look at spiders as they are developing their extraordinary webs, and document it and conserve it. Know that there's a amazing brain behind all of this activity, and that brain is not simple but pretty sophisticated, even if it is the brain of an insect and it is small in size. These structures often offer as object lessons in sustainable living. If one only sits and thinks about them, then you realize how amazing they are in terms of how they fit in the environment, and without actually destroying the environment, which is something that humans have been very good at doing. I mean, a lot of our inventions leave a lasting scar on the earth. We are not incorporating in our engineering ways of sustainable living, and that's only just beginning to start. Many of the problems we face is because of these practices. They offer insights into both biology and engineering. You can take that thought as deep as you want. It can occupy you endlessly. But above all, they're just fun. And I really encourage all of you who are listening to my talk to look more closely at your backyard. So with that, I want to thank you all for. I hope I've completed well with the solar eclipse, which I think is still going on. But you can catch the end of it just as we finish the talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sanjay. You can stop sharing your screen.
Okay.
So we have one hand raised, and I'm going to let them speak now. So please go ahead and ask your question or share your comment on this.
Sorry, where am I looking?
You can look at participants.
So if you click on the participants tab.
Yeah, I got it.
Yeah.
So you'll see someone has raised their hand and talking is permitted now, so they can ask their question to you.
Yes, Diamond Lang.
Diamond Lang, would you wish to speak?
You'll have to unmute yourself.
Anyone else who wants to speak, please raise your hand. Rudra, please ask your question.
I can't hear the question.
They haven't.
Can Diamond Lang type the question in the, if the mic isn't working, then type the question in the Q&A. We can go over that. Rudra?
Rudra, can you unmute yourself and ask the question?
I can't hear.
I think she had some problem with the mic. Okay, we'll ask Nachiket.
Yeah. So whenever I got the termites, they come to my home. For some reason, they're always attracted to light.
Yes.
Why are they attracted to light?
It's an interesting question. In general, many insects are attracted to light, famously moths that even will go in and burn in a flame, which has led to much poetry. The question why they are attracted to light is not easy to answer. It's not something one can really form a hypothesis with. We can answer how they detect light, how their eyes, for instance, detect light, and then we can talk about how the nervous system then causes them to react in a way that brings them closer to the source of light. There are some ideas about the why question, which again, as I said, is not really answerable. But some ideas are that light is often used in nature as a reference. So the moon is a source of reference for animals that are flying. In the case of termites, this may be a way of sort of just being in one place where they can find more mates or something like that. Although I don't know in nature that there are any comparable sources of light. This is really something that we see in artificial circumstances. But light, they do fly in some reference to light. And what happens is that if there is light, and if you have a specific, if you keep yourself oriented specifically towards the light, then the natural result of that is that you spiral inwards, and that, at least that's what scientists think.
Okay, thank you.
We can try Rudra now. Rudra seems to be unmuted. Rudra, please ask your question. Hello?
No, there is still,
Still no
still can't hear. Yeah, okay. Yes, Rudra? No, I can't hear.
Okay, then let's move on to Shubhada.
Shubhada, you can unmute yourself and ask the question. I think we can just go to the questions that have been written. Pavitra, would you like to read them out to Sanjay, just so all the audience knows?
So one of the questions is, when you were speaking about the termite resealing the mound when there's a hole, where's that mud coming from? And is it from outside? So is there some kind of chain of transfer? And is this based on chemical signals, or is there some other process as far as you know?
That's an excellent question. The most of the mud comes from just around the hole. So, as I said, it's a two-step process. The first step is to seal the hole as quickly as possible. Now, the challenge there is that when you make a hole in the mound, the termites, remember, they don't have eyes, they need to detect these, okay? And we've figured out through a series of experiments that, in fact, even though they don't have eyes, they're somehow detecting the light that filters in through the hole. And that's what, is one of the cues that drives them to come to this site. And once a hole is discovered, there must be, we think, a communication system that allows termites to recruit other termites. Then they come to the hole, they take little balls of mud and they start to patch up this hole. So the initial, just as if you were to have a wound, the first thing that happens is just a patch that comes on it, and then the skin will remodel and sort of mend itself. Similarly, the first thing that the termites do is close the hole, because a hole is a very dangerous thing, as you saw in that film with Attenborough. Ants can come in, water can come in, all sorts of things can happen if there are holes in the mound. So what they do is just very quickly patch it up. And once it is patched up, and quite likely they use chemicals to sort of indicate to other termites where to work. And this is a problem that Shubha is studying in my lab, that they lay some sort of a chemical that then keeps the termites there. And then that is something that then is worked on more rigorously.
So we have another question about, so Shubhada is also not talking yet. So let's just go back to the Q&A box. So here someone is asking about, the chemical trail. So are these termites all leaving the exact same chemical trail, or do they have their own traces that include their DNA?
These are chemicals that are extruded by some glands on the termite, and they are smeared across the surface. Sternal glands, they are in the sternum, so just between their legs, which they rub against the substrate. But these are chemicals. They don't contain DNA necessarily. These are just chemical extrudes of it. Some dead cells there might have some DNA, but that's not what they're really doing. Those trails can be of many different types. So in fact, there is a very sophisticated communication system that involves just chemicals. And different chemicals signify different things. For instance, if you just take the activity of building involves excavation, so where you pull things out, and deposition, where you put things on. And termites cannot excavate and deposit in the same place. There need to be two different signals, which say excavate here and deposit here. Okay, and unless there are these two different signals, the termites would just dig and build in the same place, and that would really serve no purpose. And so, we think that the communication system, the chemical communication system between termites is pretty sophisticated. It involves many different kinds of chemicals, different kind to lay trails, different kind to suggest what the recruit should do, etc. There may be other cues as well, including acoustic cues. Termites will generate an audible sound when they sense danger. And we think that other termites can actually hear this sound. Of course, a lot of this we don't know for sure. We just sort of observing at this point.
Oh, that's really interesting to hear. And so Rudra was able to ask their question, and the question is about the comparative value of having these studies done in a lab versus outside in nature. And is there a trade-off between the two approaches, the controlled environment in the lab versus outside?
Again, a lovely question. This is something that strikes deep at, the research program itself. I think both are important. I think one has to have field observations. Without them, the true context of what you're doing doesn't arise. For instance, let's just take this really bizarre observation that if you put a bunch of termites in a round plastic box, then they start milling around. I mean, does this system have, does this observation have value in nature? Absolutely, because a lot of what you learn in the lab is not suddenly evolved by the termite in that little time frame. It's something that already exists, and so it gives you some insights into what's going on in the nature. So, for instance, we've learned that termites are laying trails, and that's what sustains milling. And this, this is clearly something they also must be doing in nature. And that's, so, lab assays are essential because they make working convenient, and you're able to do it under controlled conditions, very much the Cartesian way. But without nature, there really is no context to anything that you're doing in the lab. So field studies are an absolutely essential aspect of all of what I'm talking about.
Yeah, and you've mentioned that you think there should be interdisciplinary studies. So someone has asked if, this approach that's there from like class 11, should that not happen where, students either take up science or commerce or whatever. So, how do you, someone wanted your view on that.
Well, I think it's tragic that we've compartmentalized scientific disciplines or any disciplines at all. I mean, economics is a good example of something that has the ability to inform what happens in the natural world. There's a lot of economic principles that if biologists knew better, they might see the world very differently. Game theory is something that, for instance, has had tremendous impact on biology. At all levels. I have colleagues who study, who use game theoretic modeling to understand biology. So, I don't know at what point we suddenly decide that there should be compartments, and that, that one needs really deep rethinking of our curricula, so that we don't, we don't take these disciplinary boundaries too seriously. They are not something animals care about, and so we shouldn't either if we want to understand animals or anything. So my view on this is that, okay, so, it's, one can't radically change things, they're set in their way, they have a certain momentum of their own, but could we start introducing a mandatory biology or economics or, things like that? And that's beginning to happen. I think the world at large is beginning to realize the importance of multidisciplinarity, and we are seeing these movements now take form. And I think more power to them, because that's important. The other thing I would say is that our education doesn't begin and end in the classroom. We need to go out of our comfort zones. We need to, you know, look into our backyards, go for treks,